Cinnamon rolls are so divine that heaven must be filled with them. While I wasn't eating gluten for a while, I created a gluten-free yeast roll recipe, mainly with the hopes of turning it into an incredibly tasting cinnamon roll. I'm happy to say, mission accomplished. Reality is, how can you go wrong with butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, and a powdered sugar icing? I can't wait to share my recipe with you. Let's dive in. For my gluten-free cinnamon roll recipe, you'll need for the dough, milk, yeast, granulated sugar, tapioca starch or flour, xanthan gum or guar gum, baking powder, salt, egg, vanilla, butter, and a gluten-free flour mix like Namaste. For the filling, you'll also need brown sugar and cinnamon. For the icing, you'll also need powdered sugar and almond extract or vanilla, whichever you prefer. We're going to begin by greasing a 9 by 13 inch baking dish. Now I like to use butter because butter is the main fat in the recipe, but you of course can use whatever fat you want. If you're using cooking spray, that is totally fine. I'm going to just set your pan aside. In a measuring cup, you want to weigh out either 295 milliliters or 1 1/4 cups of milk. We're going to heat this in the microwave for 30 seconds until it warms up, and another 10 seconds or so until we reach that 100 to 110 degree temperature. In a bowl, measure out 50 grams, which is 1/4 cup of granulated sugar. Then in a small bowl, we're going to add 12 grams, which is 1 tablespoon of yeast. From the measured out sugar, we're going to take 1 tablespoon. This will be used to activate the yeast, having that little bit of sugar, and then just set the sugar aside for later. And then from our warmed milk, we're just going to eyeball and measure out about 59 milliliters, which is about 1/4 cup of milk, just enough to moisten our mixture here. And then just give it a quick whisk or stir with your fork. And then we're just going to set this aside for about 10 minutes for the yeast to activate, becoming bubbly and frothy. All right, go ahead and dice 57 grams, which is about 4 tablespoons of butter. I want it diced because it'll just melt a lot easier. And then we're going to put that into the rest of the milk that we did not put into the yeast mixture. So we're going to put this in the microwave again because we want to melt that butter. We're going to put it in there for about 30 seconds, stir, and then add more time if needed until the butter is melted. Okay, once your milk and butter have sort of cooled down just a bit, crack an egg, give it a quick little whisk, beat it just slightly, and then we're going to add it to our milk and butter mixture. This recipe is actually my regular gluten-free yeast roll recipe. The only difference is for the base bread, I put 1 teaspoon of vanilla in this one that I don't put in the savory version. Give it a little whisk and we're gonna set this aside. Now let's mix the dry ingredients. In a large bowl, we're gonna add 276 grams, which is 2 cups of gluten-free, all-purpose flour. Whatever you have at home is fine. You do not have to sift this flour, but I have clumps in my flour and I just find it easier that I don't have to stir so much to get those clumps out once everything is mixed together. Sifting of your flour makes your life a lot easier. To our flour, we're going to add 92 grams, which is 3/4 cup of tapioca flour or starch. We're going to add 8 grams, which is 2 teaspoons of xanthan gum. Gums are important in creating a stretch like a gluten stretch, and since we don't have gluten, we have to have something that resembles gluten to give us that stretch. We're also going to add 8 grams, which is 2 teaspoons of baking powder so we can get a nice rise. 6 grams, 1 teaspoon of salt. Finally, the remaining sugar, from which we took 1 tablespoon for our yeast. Using a whisk or fork, we just want to stir this up really, really well. Give it a good mix. Make a well in the middle of your flour mixture. Pour in our butter and milk mixture, which has the egg and the vanilla in it. And take a look at our yeast. It has bubbled up. It's frothy. It's what we want. So we're going to add that to our mixture as well. And we're going to give this a really good stir. You want to make sure that when you think you've stirred this enough, stir about another 30 seconds because it takes a little bit for the gluten-free flours to really soak in the liquid, and you don't want any dried clumps when you go to cut into your cinnamon roll. I usually go back in with my fork. I just sort of rake it across the dough just to make sure that it's sort of smoothed out and I don't have any flour clumps in there. So after mixing all of your ingredients, place a piece of parchment paper down on a work surface. And then we're going to add some either gluten-free flour to that and or some tapioca starch. I've done both together. I've done them separately. It doesn't matter. You just need something to keep our dough from sticking to the parchment paper because it's a little wet. So we want to make sure we have something there, a barrier. Okay, so scoop out your dough onto your floured surface. It does look a lot more like batter, like a quick bread batter than it does a bread dough because there's no gluten. Flour your hands, give your dough just a little bit of a knead. Okay, sort of shape it into a rectangle. Now you're going to pat this out or roll it out into a 17 by 12 inch rectangle. Brush, this is 43 grams, which is 3 tablespoons of softened butter. We're going to brush it from side to side and end to end. In a small bowl for the filling, we're going to add 35 grams, a quarter of a cup of the gluten-free flour. This will help keep the cinnamon and sugar from running out of the rolls in the oven because this is gluten-free. It doesn't really soak up and doesn't expand like regular flour does. So to this flour, we're going to add 8 grams, which is 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. And let's just give that a quick stir and combine that. Okay, now we're going to add 166 grams, which is 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar. Mix this up really well. And then just scatter the filling all over our dough. And then just spread it out and then lightly pat it down into the dough. Pat it into the butter in the dough so that the cinnamon and sugar and flour adhere. Okay, we're going to start at one short end and we're going to use the parchment paper to help us start rolling up. And the parchment paper is good here because if we have any stickiness with the dough, since there's no gluten in it, this dough can sort of fall apart a little easier. And so the parchment just helps keep it held together. Although I really don't have many issues because we have floured it well, so it should roll up fairly easily. Okay, notice it just rolled right on up. If you haven't had any tears or holes in your dough, then just simply patch it up because this dough manipulates really well. All right, I'm actually going to take mine off the paper because I think we're in good shape. And we're going to divide these into 8 pieces. If you start in the center, just eyeball it. Cut the dough, roll in half. Okay, and then cut each half in half. So now we have 4. And if you want, you can actually trim off the ends so that it sits flat in the pan, your roll. Then you can cook those separately if you wanted to. Toaster oven, and you can have your own little test roll there. Okay, and then each we're going to cut in half. I like to use a serrated knife here because it keeps our rolls from mashing as we're cutting them. Notice how that serrated knife just saws right through. Set these in. We want to touch the edges where they're sort of rolled. So I like to stick them together pretty close. That final edge roll is right there. And so I have it touching another roll so they don't separate when they're rising. We're going to cover the rolls. You can use plastic wrap or a towel. And we're going to let them sit in a warm area to rise for about 30 minutes to an hour. If you want, you could go ahead and preheat your oven or just wait until you're 30 minutes away from putting these in the oven, then preheat the oven to 350 degrees. Okay, our rolls have puffed up, so now we're going to remove the plastic and place them in the oven to bake for 25 minutes or until golden brown. Check that out, the rolls are hot out of the oven. Beautiful swirls, they expanded, have wonderful cinnamon, brown sugar filling. Now it's time to make the icing. So to make the icing, I like a powdered sugar, almond extract, and milk in mine. In a small bowl, I'm going to add 180 grams, which is 1.5 cups of powdered sugar. I love almond extract on my cinnamon rolls, but you could add vanilla instead, or you can do a combination. I've done both vanilla and almond extract. And then I'm going to add 1/4 teaspoon of almond extract. And since I like a thick frosting and icing, I like to see my icing on top of my cinnamon rolls. I'm not going to put a whole lot of milk in here. I just eyeball it, but it's going to be between 1 and 3 tablespoons, maybe 4 or 5, depending on how thin you want and how thick you want your icing. So I always try to start out with about 1 tablespoon and then just add a little more as I go. And then give it a good stir so that you don't have any clumps of powdered sugar. Looks pretty good, that's thick, but I'm wanting a thick icing. So that works for me. If you want it thinner, just add some more milk. You can frost these now, or you can wait until they've cooled some, but who can wait to eat a cinnamon roll after it's cooled? So I like to go ahead and frost them now and then just drizzle over the top. And as it starts to melt, you can sort of spread it out. We have our gluten-free iced cinnamon rolls. Take a look at the inside. You may have a little bit of cinnamon and brown sugar that oozes to the bottom of the pan, but that's okay. Most of it stays in our cinnamon roll here. So nice and ooey gooey it is on the underside. You can see all those rolls. The icing is staying nice and firm on top. You can see the rolls on the inside. Brown sugar and cinnamon are in. You can see them between the layers there. The icing has oozed down in between the layers too, so that makes it even a gooier cinnamon roll. You still have the sort of the airy pockets that you would see in a normal yeast roll. It's just that this does not puff up as much, and you don't have those gluten fibers stretching to produce even bigger holes, looking like a regular yeast bread. These rolls are gluten-free and can easily be made dairy-free by using a plant-based milk like coconut milk and plant-based butter. Store the rolls at room temperature up to 5 days. I always separate them, wrap each in plastic wrap, place in the freezer bag, and store in the freezer for up to several months. Remove from frozen and heat in the microwave until heated through. They stay fresh, tasting as though they were just made. If you have gluten-free or dairy-free eaters for your holiday gatherings, I think they would be very pleased to have an ooey gooey rich cinnamon roll that's so indulgent that they could eat. I know how happy I am when I eat one. Thanks for watching, liking, and subscribing. Until next time, go bake the world.